I'm Matthew Woods, host of Leading Out of the Woods, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other interesting education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
You and I know what A, B, and C are. We understand our alphabet most days.
Well, you think so. I've always learned the D went after. I'm just Google around. It's like
you gotta Google around.
Yes, yes, sir. That's a word. Thank you. That's cool. And meanwhile, Skype is like, hiding out in an alley. It is that time. You are listening to the High Tech Podcast with Josh Schwartz. That's me. And our new host, no, I'm just joking. Will Illior.
Could you imagine if that's how you told me?
You're still here, and I'm like, surprise, new host.
What, Josh, why is there a black box in the Zoom area? What's this? What's going on in Zoom?
What is this? Let me just put you in the waiting room here for a second, Will, and then I'll bring you back. Don't worry. For the episode. That's ridiculous. I couldn't do the High Tech Podcast without Will Illingworth. Anyway, we're back. And you're like, you've never left. We're like, we know, but we kind of did. We've been releasing episodes, but we haven't been. It's been a little bit.
We have not been recording for weeks.
No, we have not been recording. One of us is a travel machine.
I don't know what you're talking about.
And it is clearly not me. No, I'm just joking. Anyway, super excited to be back. Super excited to jump into our topics this week. But before we do, just a reminder, if you're listening to the High Tech Podcast and you haven't checked us out online, and you're like, but I'm listening to you. I've checked you out online. Yeah, but if you haven't checked out our Twitter or our website.
You haven't gone fully.
You haven't went fully. You know what I mean? Like that, there's
like just like that.
Just like that.
Yeah.
So anyway, check us out if you haven't already. Check us out on Twitter at High Tech Podcast, and make sure to subscribe. We love to connect with people there and post fun gifs. If you still like to email, you can hit us up at inbox at hightechpod.us.
.us.
I was gonna say it looked like you wanted to do it. I could feel it. Both of those places are wonderful places to send us communications or a picture of an animal, like we have requested from you every episode since the dawn of the podcast. That's not true. We haven't done that.
Yeah,
it's basically been like season
find out 2. When did we start that?
I don't really remember. It started as like a thing we were just doing, and I was like, I kind of like this. And then when I was like at my darkest moment, ready to stop asking for animals, somebody drew us a hand-drawn animal, and I was like, it's worth it.
Thank you, Manny.
And now we continue to do it. So anyway, so if you'd like to send us this week, I would like a tap dancing tauntaun. Okay? That's what I'd like. Tap dancing tauntaun. Send that to our email and inbox at hightechpod.us or our Twitter at hightechpodcast.
Signed, sealed, delivered, baby.
Yeah, exactly. If you don't know what a tauntaun is, Google it. And then find one tap dancing or create it. If you find this picture in the wild, I'm gonna be so impressed. I haven't Googled this, but I'd be very surprised.
Yeah.
If it's out there in the wild. Anyway, other places you can check us out, hightechpod.us. That's our website. We have one, surprise, and each episode comes with a fun little episode page. And if it's one where we talk about a tool, that page always mentions tool, gives you some resources on how to get started with that tool, and some musings from Will and I on that page. So
yes, and that's the thing to share to others, right? We want,
exactly.
If you want to, like, oh my gosh, Josh and Will talked about Nearpod today. It's so amazing. Grab that link, send that link to friends. That will help them get set up with whatever the tool is. So.
Yeah, and they can see our pretty faces on the website and check out some more information.
Faces.
Well, things. Anyway, enough of that craziness. You can check us out online. But so this week, what are we talking about, Will?
I don't know. It's a little hard in my mind. It's like it's like fuzzy. It's not really working.
Yeah, it's like.
Every time I try and think about it, it just doesn't. I can't set.
It's like I've got some dissonance going on.
Is this a bad joke? Is this a bad bit?
It is kind of a bad. I mean, have we ever had good bits? I'm not sure.
Fair.
We have. I'm gonna just be honest.
Totally fair.
Yeah.
This week, trying to dig into cognitive dissonance. Josh and I talk so much about so many things. This probably came out of as a topic. They probably came out one of the times we're talking about cognitive load. We, believe.
I thought you were going to say when we were talking about cognitive dissonance. Like, well, yes.
Yes.
That is true.
We were talking about it, so we wrote it down. No.
Yeah, it was the whole thing.
We believe that, right, Josh? I believe you can say I do when I say this. We believe that the mind and psychology are important to learning.
No, I think it's ridiculous.
See, I figured.
Hogwash. Who has a brain?
None of that crap.
I mean, like, there's clear ways. I mean, there's a lot we still learn about how our brains work. I think we like to think we know everything. There's a lot of thinking in that about how our brains work, but they're very complicated. But I think we've learned a lot about how we process information, how we retain information. There's been a lot of studies into what it looks like to actually, what does it look like to retain something? Like what actually physically is happening.
What's the mental process? What's going on in the brain? But how long does it take? Do you need to repeat it more than once? Like there's plenty of statistical studies there looking at the effectiveness of teaching skills or teaching styles, teaching strategies based on types of learners and context of learners. So important. But that comes back to, for us, this just the idea of cognitive dissonance. There's so many things that happen while we're teaching. Sometimes it's related directly to cognitive load, right? That's a very easy one to be like, oh my gosh, you overloaded your students at the extraneous or the germane level. Something happened, right? And they just can't function anymore. But that results in cognitive dissonance. And I think that there's space for us to kind of make sure we're aware of this as a motivational factor. I think it's one of these things that definitely comes up when we do audience analysis. Like instructional designers, it's one of the first things we do. We need to do the analysis step of our design process. We want to know who our audience is, who our teachers are, what the content is, right? And so one of those things that happens with those learners early on is like, who are they? What are they interested in? What are they good at doing? Where are they in their program? All these kinds of questions. And that can start to even immediately evaluate or lift to you like issues that are going to come up in the classroom. If this is an online class, right, then, maybe the issues of students being hot and tired in the classroom aren't an issue, but the students being distracted by ironing and, their actual jobs, right? There's plenty of things at home that can distract them. That dissonance, all that is the noise that gets in the way of learning. And I think being aware of it and searching for methods to accommodate it are important. Like one of these things that I think comes back from maybe a more traditionalist perspective on teaching is they should just get over it, right? The teacher might say they should just get over it. They don't like my tests, too bad. They don't like how I sound, too bad. They don't like how I only lecture, too bad, right? That too bad attitude about teaching, I think, is becoming less and less. But it is one of those things like, oh, the students aren't paying attention right now. Too bad. That's on them. Oh, the students are having a hard week because of something that's catastrophically happening in the world. Too bad. That's on them. Oh, the student had a death in the family. No, you still need to meet my due dates, right? Like we've heard about these kinds of attitudes enough that they can be kind of hard to deal with. But at the end of the day, the challenge to those kinds of people is like, cognitive dissonance structures or issues that you have with the structures of learning for a student can be anything. They can be physical, they can be mental, they can be emotional. I know plenty of folks these days that are really honest with the fact that like when they're emotionally upset, and I get it, like it's harder to learn. It's harder to do things. It's harder to operate. Absolutely. So it makes sense. Pointing out the issue itself makes sense and why we want to address it. But like trying to find healthy ways to cultivate safe learning environments, like it's not just like huggy-feely or touchy-feely, like, oh, let's make sure everybody's like comfortable. It's like if your students are not capable of learning because something's in the way, this is a barrier, is there something we can do proactively to make it easier? I think that's the goal. Trying to look at and address cognitive dissonance, that's definitely the goal with this conversation.
Yeah. It's acknowledging a stumbling block, an issue that can get in the way, and trying to figure it out. Now, some of you may be like, "That's great. But what is actually cognitive dissonance? This feels like another one of those fancy words that means something very simple. And you are right-ish. It's I don't know if it's simple because it is kind of a weird thing. But like when you talk about it, so like okay, so I'll give my definition here in a second. But I'm actually very curious because Will and I do so much prep. So we've talked about this clearly already, and this is all scripted. That's not true.
We script the just so we sound natural.
Yeah, well, I gotta give the AI something to get rid of. So, and I just did it. What would you do? How do you define cognitive dissonance? So if you're like, 5-word definition or maybe 30, how would you define cognitive dissonance?
Yeah. If we were looking at cognitive load as our psychology that's driving like what's happening in the mind while we learn, when we have students learning well and there's a balanced cognitive load, I'd like to say that's like there's harmony. Like that's just working. That's balanced. It's harmonistic. It's good. Cognitive dissonance is anything that gets in the way of that harmony, like things that break up the balance of the personal motivations, the learning experience, the teaching style, anything in that kind of triangle that gets in the way. One of them doesn't show up to the triangle party. That's, I think, what breaks it down. That's what cognitive dissonance is to me.
Okay, that's interesting. So, like, because the way I think it's close, but I think, and this is where it comes out of, like, these conversations are fun because you have more of a formal background and I have more of, like, I just secretly pick up words as my friends who work in the field.
I listen
more of
a lot.
Formal background, yeah. And because the way I usually, like, think of it is I do think of it as this break of harmony, but I think maybe I've thought of it maybe a little bit more specific, which is this idea of, like, cognitive dissonance being in a situation where the harmony is kind of out of... The lack of harmony exists because you're presented with an idea that goes against what you believe or have experienced.
Oh, okay.
Right? So, like, this idea of... like, well, we'll just go right down to it. Like some of the conversations that happen around race, right?
Sure.
This always comes up, cognitive dissonance, where it's this idea of like everybody has different experiences and it breaks it apart. But even just like you see it happen with students. Like, I mean, I've been teaching before and you'll share an idea with them about something, or like we work in kind of religion teaching and so I'm teaching Bible stuff, and they're like, well, that goes against what I learned, and I'll be like, well, let's have a little hot take conversation here.
Let's tear apart what you learned.
yeah, but you always have that reaction, right? And all of us are this way. Like we've experienced
that's
something, we
great.
know something, and the harmony falls apart when you're presented with an idea that goes literally in contrast to what you've learned or thought up to this point.
Right.
Now, I may be kind of merging cognitive dissonance with this idea of distortion. Like I know there's like different terminologies for some of this stuff. So like, but at the end of the day, who cares? This is a high-tech podcast, not the psych.
Where everything's made
podcast.
up where everything is made up and the points don't matter.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I really like you.
Does that make sense?
I like you bringing that point to it because I think that's something that we might like. What I'm trying to point out about cognitive dissonance is definitely something that we see happen almost in all learners. Okay. But it's not explicit. Like you don't know if a student is not feeling well unless they tell you, or it's visible. You don't know if a student is not understanding your speaking style, literally how you speak, if you have an accent, if you are UK English versus US English, anything like that, right? Like you just don't know. But your point, like that's a cognitive dissonance that's probably going to become pretty evident pretty quickly, right? If you're saying in the classroom a very conservative ideal around economics or around politics, and your students are very liberal in their ideals and their economics, then that's a dissonance. There's already going to be this tension in the learning process, and the right side is not going to be as receptive to the left side. Very easy to see true. That, and that's going to. The students are not going to be quiet about it. Let's put it that way.
Well, yeah, most. I mean, there are definitely going to be some that just don't care and don't interact. Like, you'd be like, I don't see why they're... So, like, because I think, like, a more subtle way of seeing it is, like, I think we still have this at the core sometimes when, like, students are just, like, not getting an idea. Like, you're explaining a concept to them, and they're just, like, I don't understand why they're not getting it. Well, it's because it doesn't line up with something either they already knew or... They're struggling to work through it. And so I think like I think my definition really lends itself well to the politics conversation and the different situations.
It's easy.
But like it's easy to see it that way, but I think we still see it in a lot of different areas where it's just like it could just be like a new idea that they've never heard before. And I feel like this is also why we as professors and instructors forget what it's like to learn some of the new concepts, because we're just like, well, I don't know why you're getting it. It just makes sense. Like it's this, and this. It's like, yeah, but this, and this never computed for me.
Right.
And I think even in that, maybe I'm stretching the definition a bit, but even in that, I feel like that's still kind of a cognitive dissonance. It's not necessarily going directly against an already held belief or already held idea, but it's kind of this idea of like, you get this dissonance because that idea, like they don't even have a box to put it in.
No,
I
don't
really have
like
something
that.
to figure it out.
I really like that, because like some of the points I was raising are maybe environmental or the experience. Then you kind of raise this idea of like, well, maybe it's just that they have dissonance between the ideas being shared, and we kind of can immediately associate that with politics and whatever. But you're right. Like in syllogistic logic, A equals B. If A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, right? Like you can say that as a logic. A, B, C equal all each other if A.
Yeah, totally.
But if
totally
the student doesn't know what B is, like you and I know what A, B, and C are, we understand our alphabet most days.
Well,
but
you think so?
If that was like,
D. I've always learned that D went after. I'm just.
if this was, I don't know, some complex structure, like if a Panzer tank equals another kind of tank that equals another, it doesn't matter which of the three tanks you're trying to use in the syllogistic logic if I don't know what a Panzer tank is. Like just saying that a Panzer tank equals another tank doesn't help the learner who still doesn't know what a Panzer tank is, right?
Yeah.
We should take some tank courses just so we have better examples for our
if only somebody created a tank course. Like a really deep one.
We could make so much money on this.
We could make so much money. And I feel like we're probably stretching like the very traditionalist. Like, so there's a psychologist somewhere.
Would these two just shut up already?
Like, would these two just stop? This is not what it is. And I know we're probably stretching the definition a little bit, but I think what we're trying to get at is just this idea that we often don't, like, at least I see in like higher ed, for instance, we don't necessarily like give a definition to. And the reason I think you and I wanted to talk about this topic is because we wanted to get around this idea of like, okay, we know that this is a thing, that there is a lack of harmony when people are trying to process ideas, and it could be for whatever reason. It could be literal physical, emotional stuff that's affecting them. It could be that they've already had a preconceived idea in there. It can be that they're just not even sure how to deal with this issue, but it creates this lack of harmony or this dissonance. The point I think we're trying to get at is we need to acknowledge this and then think through, okay, how can I leverage knowing about this and actually in ways combat it or even leverage that this might happen to get students thinking deeper. So let me just throw out practical example real quick that comes to mind when I think about this. So like I have this issue, I think, when I'm often teaching students how to interpret something and they have like a completely different understanding. It never happens.
Never.
Right. And so I think one of the things I've picked up from some of our colleagues is like, this is where I find it advantageous to actually have the student share what they think first. Right. So like, and why they think that, like what led them to that. And then actually create a little dissonance to say, well, what if I was to say this, and this is actually what, like, it's so just acknowledging it ahead of time and actually having them process through why they think what they think.
Right.
And
without having to try and be the teacher in a sense, like you don't have to be so strong and leaderly about it. Like you can kind of guide the conversation instead of direct it by being like providing some alternate viewpoints. And I think you're right to point out there too. Like if you just ask them the questions or help them explain themselves more, you don't put them on the defense either by saying your side. Like if it is political or if it is something where they might not understand the full concept yet, by you providing your side of it might create more dissonance than fix the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. So like let's we're gonna get hot topic-y today, and again the purpose of what we're doing here is for the learning, but like you and I have had a lot of conversations about race stuff as because everybody wants to hear what two white guys on a podcast have to say about it. Not true. But I think one thing I would mention here that I've seen people do really well is to actually acknowledge, like, when somebody says, like, well, that's not how it is, or that situation, we butt heads about what life is like. How many times I've seen people craftily, instead of just starting the conversation saying this is what life is like, is to say, like, well, why do you think this? Right? And so they start to express their life circumstances, have somebody from the other angle explain it too, and then all of a sudden you're not combating each other anymore. You're just talking about what your experiences are in this area that can help maybe bring out why the dissonance exists. And then you start to lean into, like, just because your experience hasn't been this doesn't mean this doesn't exist.
Right.
Like, or whatever.
Well, and in a personal example that actually comes to mind that I think is relevant and slightly touchy, but is still, like, I think a good example of what you were just suggesting and how it worked in my life. Like, somebody was talking to me about an artist and cultural appropriation, and we had different opinions about what cultural appropriation was. But instead of me trying to, like, go on the offensive and wrestle through what this meant together, I was like, well, how do you define cultural appropriation? This person came out and said, this artist culturally appropriated this culture and should be canceled for it. And I was like, in my mind, are you sure? I'm not so sure. I don't necessarily agree. But before getting to that, I was able to kind of catch myself and be like, you know what? Let's walk through this together. I said, well, that's interesting. Like, how do you define cultural appropriation? And they were able to walk through their definition. I said, that's really interesting. When I see cultural appropriation, I definitely see that there's a side of, like, almost, I would say, extortion involved. Like, they're taking advantage of something. They're hurting another person by doing something directly. And by sharing just those 2 points with each other, like, we came to a better understanding of each other's points on cultural appropriation. And I don't think we ever changed any opinions about the artist in question, for instance, but, like, it was a healthy and fun example of, like, walking through the conversation as opposed to debating or getting angry about things. I think that practice for our students can really help to reduce that dissonance and can make what can be difficult topics or difficult conversations a lot easier to have. If we can kind of maybe lead from some humility, lead from curiosity in those conversations, it can really make the difference. I think all this is coming back to, though, Josh, like, we've definitely dug through our definitions and our understanding, but we care about this. We care about this because it's about motivating our learners. It's about, like, removing the barriers to their learning. I think that if we can address and be aware of cognitive dissonance, just as much as we say cognitive load and any other learning theories, reading time and watching time, talk time, anything else. But if we can really focus on this and try to isolate some of the issues involved in it, it can be a really important thing for equity and inclusion. It can be really important for creating a safe classroom. It can also just make learning better. It can make learning easier when we're not putting more issues in the way of the learners. Like, this is something that's really great. It's a technical thing, but it's also an emotional thing. It's a practical thing, but it's also a social thing. I think it's really important for the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely.
Digital and physical.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's and it looks different, I think, in some of those different areas. Like, we talked a lot about idea dissonance and, like, kind of the difference of ideas, but there's a lot, I mean, like, to your talk about, like, circumstances and even, like, this can get into accessibility issues that like can cause that. So I think the main point for us today, since we only give ourselves so much time to talk about ideas, because we clearly thought we were going to cover all of research of dissonance in like 20 to 30 minutes.
Yeah, that's what we do.
It's a pretty simple topic. The point is, I think, just acknowledging it, like acknowledging that this is going to exist and trying to think through ways of how you can overcome that, right? And how you can at least help your students through it. Acknowledging that it's not just the student's fault to figure this out. This is a regular thing that all of us deal with, of like meeting new ideas, having circumstances that can kind of break apart that harmony in that we have when trying to learn new stuff, learning new ideas, topics, concepts. So it's important. I feel like we'll come back to this conversation because I think there's a lot to cover. I think this has gotten me thinking more about like, okay, what are some of the other versions of cognitive dissonance, and like how do you? Because I think I've kind of had like a specific definition for a while, and so I think maybe there's a little bit of a broader conversation to have around what you do with that, you know,
driven by just the desire to be aware of your learners and what's happening in the classroom, and how to be a more effective teacher. You know, like, again, we don't necessarily ascribe to the attitude of too bad. So we are looking to say, like, if my learners are not hitting their numbers, right, test numbers, quizzes, grades, whatever, but if that's demonstrating that they're not getting the content knowledge, I want to do anything I can to help them with that. I mean, the most consistent place that I've taught throughout my life, I've taught higher education, I've taught like nonprofit education, ESL, things like that. But the thing that I've done since I was 16 was taught martial arts. And I think it's really easy to see if someone's learning a martial art. It's demonstrative. If they can physically do what you showed them how to do, then you're good. This is something that shows up even in that physical space. And I've had to work with learners who have ADD. I've had, or ADHD, whichever one is clinically accurate. Forgive me if I've picked the one that was not clinically accurate. I've had to work with learners with autism and on the ASD spectrum. I've had to help people who are just angry. Teaching humans is not clean cut. And so that dissonance thing, when it comes to the martial arts, like I've had some students who were like just ready to quit and found a way to reach through the dissonance that was happening for them and motivate them, and they were able to continue and stay on to become, black belts after 5 and 6 years of training. Like, that's awesome when that works. But martial arts, it's a much longer process. I think in higher education, we get a semester with them, and it's usually not enough time to fix the issue. So can we address it before the course even starts? Can we be aware of it while teaching? Can we stay on top of the stuff so that we don't lose people's opportunity to learn whatever our valuable content is, tanks or not, so they can get there. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So we'll come around to that conversation maybe again. But I feel like we need to come around to
I didn't even notice.
To another element.
See it happen.
That was a ninja transition, stealth transition.
Golf clap.
Thank you. I'm evolving to a new level of transition. I will say that, and then like next week it'll be the worst one.
Just trashed.
So we have a tool though we want to talk about. So it is called Around. Okay, that's if you didn't get that through my transition. Now everybody's like, oh, it makes so much sense. I know, guys. I know. Anyway, so this is a video conferencing tool, and probably some of you guys are like, it's called Around, and some of you guys are like, really, guys, another video conferencing tool? Have you seen Zoom?
Yes.
And I'll be like, yes, I have. We did an episode on it because we thought we were super cool.
Crazy.
But I was introduced to this a couple weeks ago, and I think it was ironically on a Tuesday when we record, and so I shared it with you, and you and I were talking about it a little bit, and we were like, we gotta bring this one out. So one of my coworkers shared this one with me. And so it's just called Around. You can go to around.co. It's a little hard to find because it's titled Around, so you just like Google Around. It's like
you gotta Google Around.
Yes, sir. That's a word. Thank you. Or you Google like Around video conference, and it'll find it.
That's what I did, and it came right up.
Yeah. So it's a pretty cool tool. I think like the best way to describe it. Listen, it's not anything like mind-blowingly different. Okay, it's not like Gather Town like we've talked about. Like it's a completely different type of tool. It's not anything like that. But what I really like about Around is that I think the way I would call it is it's more of like a social video conference tool. It's kind of like a middle ground between like a Gather Town and Zoom.
Yeah.
Like there are rooms to it. You can kind of create like a hub for your institution or organization that you can kind of access and connect with people on. But the big selling point for me with Around that is really cool that I wish we could get is so much more nowadays. We end up in like, I don't know about you, Will, but at least I do. I end up in video conference rooms with like other people on Zoom, or the classic, like I'm in a room,
the new hybrid
with someone
world.
else. Yeah, like the new hybrid world, or I'm in like a general room where in my wonderful open office that I love so much. Thank you, Google. I can hear like a coworker talking on the Zoom meeting that we're both in, and like nobody else really gets the feedback, but I get the feedback type of situation. Around has this sweet feature that is, they call it like noise. I think they call it noise suppression. I'm trying to look through their list of features of what they actually end up calling it. But it's essentially this concept, right? So like if Will and I were in a meeting together, we're in the same room on Zoom, but we want to actually get on our individual devices, which I want to do quite often, like when we're doing it, because I'd like to be able to like be in the meeting and sharing screen and stuff. I don't have to keep looking up at a big screen. And webcams are often placed weird in the rooms that we come into because there's never a perfect place.
Yep.
And so Around gives you the ability to say like, okay, Will and I are in the same meeting room together when we get in. Okay. And what it will do is actually suppress Will's audio to me and suppress my audio to Will. But no one else. So like if Will was talking, I could hear him in the room, but I'm not getting feedback from my Zoom device or from my from Around. Zoom. From Around, and same the other way around. And so the same way. But everybody else would hear us perfectly fine. Okay. This works well for hybrid meetings, but also classrooms. Like I've had to this whole semester, I had to teach. And I had some people on Zoom occasionally.
Yeah.
And it's just becoming a regular part of.
And that was the big issue at the beginning of the pandemic, where everybody was like, "Oh, we can do hybrid learning." And it's like, let's everybody bring your laptops to class, or the 50-50 splits. You remember that? Like, let's do 50% of the students in the room. The issue with that always was echo. This whole like that's the thing. If you can't have more than one mic on.
Like I had a student who would be remote, and they were the only student remote, or there were only two of them, right? And we were doing larger groups than two, so I didn't want to just like break them out by themselves,
right?
And so what we got into the pattern of doing is like a student in the classroom. I had my laptop too in case we needed to use it, but a student in the classroom who was good friends with them also had her laptop, and so she would jump into the Zoom meeting so that whenever we did group work, she could just have her laptop with the person there, and they could just talk as a group of 4 or 5. But it was always a dance of like, okay,
who's got the laptop this week?
You make sure you mute your computer and speaker now, because we're gonna switch over to the group mode.
We're about to get a loud echo if we don't.
And I can send them into breakout rooms, which solves that problem too. But then there's always like, you have to make sure you do it you have to make sure you're getting there and doing it.
It's just a frustration point.
As opposed to like an Around, we could both have just entered the conference, both set that we're in the same room, and not have to do anything the rest of the meeting.
Right.
That would be it. And so for me, I think that's like the biggest feature I like. It's just a cool concept. The rest of the tool is pretty simple. It is pretty social.
It's just another video conferencing tool in some sense, but
yeah, it's got some integrations and stuff. It's fun. I think it's worth checking out. I am always about trying to find a tool that can maybe break apart the mega tool that's running the area, Zoom and Microsoft Teams. Although I don't know if I'd put Microsoft Teams on the same level as Zoom. They're They're like, hey, we're here. And Zoom's like, oh, that's cool. And meanwhile, Skype is like, hiding out in an alley. Like, we did rule the universe once. Let me tell you,
we started this. We
back
built
in the
this
90s
city
when people still wanted a call like tone when they're entering. Yeah, exactly. Anyway,
does this are they freemium?
Yeah, so they do have their freemium. They have pricing. So ironically, their pricing is literally the same as Zoom. I think it's hilarious.
Wow.
Like, it's pretty close. You can get like group meetings up to 45 minutes, unlimited rooms, 50 participants in a meeting, unlimited one-on-one time. Couple things that they do have that are also cool that I almost forgot about. They have a notes feature in Around, so you can have meeting notes that somebody takes inside Around, and Around will auto send those notes out to everybody then at the end, which is kind of cool.
That's cool.
And you can even like mention each other, and Around will help notice that. They have direct integration with Slack and Google Calendar, which is cool. And that's all in the free that you can get that stuff. Plus personalized URLs, noise suppression. And then here's my other thing that I really like. This is why it's a little bit more social. They have like games and vibes. You can like set
for the call itself.
That's like a vibe. Yeah.
Oh.
And then like, so if you're like, where I would actually end up, I laugh about this, but where I'd end up using it is like, if I'm doing like a webinar through this, I could see myself using vibe as like a, you know, kind of like an intro in the beginning as we're kind of waiting around,
Let's
you know,
set a vibe and let some music roll.
Set a vibe, you know. The other thing that I absolutely love is that if I send a GIF in a round, it appears in my camera picture. It actually overrides my face and becomes my face. It was, I think the person who showed, so for context, the person who showed this to me is my director. We were in a leadership meeting with our management team, and he wanted to try it out because he was just curious about it. So we used it for the management team, and I think he regretted that decision because like every sad thing he told me in that meeting, it was like a sad GIF every time, or like an angry GIF. Like I was loving it.
He's like, Josh, could you stop being distracting? I'd like to get through this meeting.
So anyway, it was cool.
Josh was just there to wreak some cognitive dissonance on him.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, that's the free mode. They do have a paid version that's like per user. Guests are free in the thing, just like in Zoom. But it's like $8.97 a month for pro, and then like for more of like an official version, it's like $15.97 a month per user. But there's like, obviously there's kind of like a deal situation, so they give you kind of like the
more users, the less it costs. Yeah.
Either way, you can try it out for free. If you're looking for an alternative, for some reason your institution hasn't committed to Zoom, you can.
Or you're looking like, I know faculty from the early days who would have loved that vibe thing. Like, of course. Of course, the sound suppression thing, that's fantastic. But like, I just want there to be music on in the background when people show up. It's like, well, I can't play your Spotify playlist because that breaks copyright laws, or like whatever. It's like, oh, a round just has vibes built into it. Perfect. Yeah. Like that's what I would.
Yeah, I could see using this as a team, a little less like education space, but I could see using this as a team. Honestly, if I was just like doing my own stuff, like
virtual happy hour
and stuff, like virtual happy hour, they actually have a thing that does that. I forgot to mention that. Yeah, overall, I think it's just cool. So like, if you are looking for an alternative to like a Zoom that's, in my opinion, a little bit more fun, has some cool stuff, but all the major features that Zoom has,
cool,
I'd give it a try. So
sweet. We'll have to do a round or two in it, but
boom, nailed it.
Waka waka. Well, folks, this has been another episode of the High Tech Podcast. As always, we had fun. We hope you did too. Next week, we're going to be coming to episode 61. Outstanding.
Woo! We're a grandparent.
We are old, yes.
We are old.
We're going to start a 2-part series. Is that a series? Just a 2-part episode?
Yeah, it used to be a series in old High Tech Podcast.
It's an episode in 2 parts.
In season 1 High Tech Podcast, that was a series. Season 2, we stepped it up. We started doing 3 episodes. So now it's kind of just like it's a sprint.
We just realized that this topic's one of our favorites, and it's not gonna work in one. So we're going to get into LMS, the LMS Learning Management System, as surveillance ? Should we?
Little big brothery conversation is what we're gonna kind of have. You know.
Yeah, I hate Big Brother. I don't know if you've ever picked up on that from my
that doesn't come through at all.
Conversations, but I have been Big Brother, and it's hard for me. It's hard for me to
technically could be Big Brother now if I wanted to be.
So we'll dig into that as our conversation. Then we'll hit up this app called Mentimeter. I've been using it a little bit for my work. It's definitely one of those top-notch engagement software that's hitting the market right now. But looking forward to that conversation. Until then, do find us on Twitter at High Tech Podcast. Like us, tweet us, retweet us, share us, friend us, subscribe to us, review us, give us.
I don't know. That's a thing.
I don't know. I just do anything you can with us on Twitter.
You can tweet us a review. I would be cool with that. That's fine. Like, unless it's negative, then don't do that.
Oh, I can take it. Josh can't, but I can.
It'd be fun.
You can also connect with us by email at inbox@hightechpod.us, and then you can find our website, hightechpod.us, where we have all of our episodes, all of our resources. Always looking for collaborations, always looking for opportunities. We are members of the Education Podcast Network, as you now hear every single episode. So if you'd like to join us in that space, reach out. We'd be glad to provide more information, or feel free to listen to all the other wonderful education podcasts on the Education Podcast Network. Yeah. I don't know why, I just felt like a double up this week on them.
Yeah.
Until next week, thank you again, as always, for joining us in the process of learning what it looks like to harness technology in the physical and digital classroom. Until next week, see ya.
See ya.